This class is about curriculum. I know, right? Oh, what a wonderful topic to begin the day with. Everybody, I can tell, you're so excited. Some of you don't know the difference between curriculum and, but we're going to work our way through some of it today. And we're excited about teaching on this topic, have some things that we've worked up, some things that we would like to share with you. I know that as we were going through yesterday's presentations of all the schools, and let me just say, great job with the presenting. I was so inspired, so full of hope. It honestly is one of my favorite things to do at the forum is to listen to how all the schools are going. And so thank you for the work that you're putting in. I know that each of you have a curriculum that you're running in your program, so you've done some work in this area. And our point today is not to say this is how it has to be done. We're simply here to say maybe you should think about this, maybe you should think about that. Have you considered this, that? These are maybe the new of developing a curriculum for your program. And each of us should have a curriculum that we are running in our program. Special word of thanks to Emmanuel, who really brought it yesterday. And even in the points where there was nothing unique about it. He made it, he's a manual, and so he made it unique just by being a manual. So thank you for that, Emmanuel. Let's jump in now. I'm going to say a prayer to get going, and then we will talk about curriculum some this morning. Let's pray. Dear God, we are really, really grateful to be here today, and we love you. We thank you for your love. We thank you for your guidance. We pray for your Spirit to be with us today and guide us through all of our discussion. And also, Father, we thank you for your Son, Jesus, who gives us hope and who allows us to be able to work with other people and to use the gifts that we have. And we ask you to magnify our gifts, and we ask you, Father, to bless our schools. And we ask you, Father, even while we're away, to be with all of our students and help them to continue to grow. We want to do good for you. We want to glorify you in every way. And I pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. So transformational teaching says this about curriculums. We'll start here. All of the planned experiences designed to bring about learning in any school setting, the plans and resources, the planned delivery, and the planned learning environment, this broad definition is important in creating a cohesive experience for the student. So, a curriculum is something that's very important for the vitality of a school. Yesterday, we looked at the 4 foundational points of a school, and the last one that we mentioned was a curriculum, and looking at, okay, what are the lessons that are going to be taught? How are they going to be taught? How are they structured? How are they built upon one another? This type of thing. It is possible to forget that what is taught in the classroom can be just as important as who is teaching or who is learning. This is where an effective and thoughtful curriculum enters the framework of the philosophy of teaching. The content of each class is important. If courses are to be cohesive, holistic, and educational, then the curriculum must be developed on the subject matter throughout the semester and from semester to semester. This takes thought, careful planning, and intention. Also, the desired outcomes of the teaching of the student must be considered. This is what Roland was talking about in his video about reverse engineering the courses and reverse engineering the classes, thinking first about what is the outcome of the student? What do we want a student that comes from our school to be? And then you go back and you work on the curriculum based on that. Curriculums ought not to be solely systems to dispense information to the student. They ought to be avenues that invite students to lifelong learning. Having said that, it is also important that if we are teaching subjects in a school setting, then the subject must be taught. And I don't know how much work you've done on developing a curriculum for a school. It is laborious work. It is hard work. And I've done it a few times in my life. Now it gets to the point where when people suggest we need to work up a curriculum for that, my body just immediately shuts down. And I'm like, I need a sabbatical, okay? It hasn't started yet, but I need a sabbatical. Because I know the amount of work that goes into it, especially if you have people in the room that don't agree on what ought to be in the curriculum and what ought to be highlighted in the curriculum. And I found when you get different leadership roles in the same room to talk about this thing, they tend not to agree at times on those kind of things. I remember a time where the teacher service team, we spent days and days and weeks and months coming up with a 12-class curriculum that we thought was perfect. We thought it was just the curriculum of curriculums. It could not be any better. And I'm telling you, it was hard work, and we did spend days, weeks, months on this thing. We had 12 courses. We wanted to have 40 hours a course. That's what we were expecting. It was graduate level. It was master's level work that we were expecting the students to do. Well, we passed it on up the food chain. We passed it on to other leadership roles and people within leadership roles. And they sliced and diced and sent it back to us. And it was like we'd never even worked on it before. You know, it was like, what is this? You know, 12 hours for a New Testament survey class. And that one actually caused me some PTSD and hurt my heart quite a bit. I actually talked to, I don't know if you know Jack Rees, but he was a professor at Harding Graduate School, and he said, what are you teaching? What's your curriculum like? And he said, I said, we have a New Testament survey course, and it's 12 hours. And he laughed out loud, okay? And not a little chuckle, okay? He laughed out loud, and he said, Steve, that's not even the survey to the survey of the New Testament. And I said, I know, but that's what we've been given, and so we're trying to do our best. And so it is hard work. It is a lot of work, and it takes thought, and it takes prayer. And you're trying to build. You're trying to build on what is already there, and you're really trying to consider your students and what is best for your students. And so these are some of the things that we're going to be highlighting in our class today, looking at as we talk about this very important topic, especially for a school of mission. Okay, curriculum. There are 3 different ways to construct a curriculum. And one way is that you can have it subject-centered. So you can simply think about the subject, put the subject in the center of all of your discussions, and that can drive the discussion of how this is going to be developed. The second way is it can be student-centered. And so you can think about, these are the students that we have, and you know that changes over time. And so if you're going to do that, then you have to revise it time and time again, because every classroom is a little bit different. But you can do it that way. You can think about the students. These are the students that we have, and so this is how we should be doing the teaching. This is how we're going to teach this subject. But the third one, and really it's the best, that curriculums ought to be teaching centered. You try to figure out, based on the subject and based on the students, how the teaching can be most effective. And that really makes for a good curriculum. Keeping that at the center of everything, keeping that in our minds as we work on a curriculum. Now, I'm going to be looking at a number of different points, and then I'm going to turn it over to Gabe, and he's got some things to speak specifically to some research that he did on the way that many of our schools have developed their curriculums over time. So, curriculum to develop, what should be considered in developing a curriculum? I have a few points here. First, we should ask, who are our students? This is where we ought to begin. We need to look at where our students are as far as learning, as far as their own educational level. Have they had much formal education before? Is actually studying something new to them? What do we hope that they will get out of the program? I mentioned this yesterday, but one great failing that we can do sometimes as teachers and trainers is try to train beyond a person, or to train as if we have not evaluated where the person is. And even Paul has a say in 1 Corinthians 3:1-2, and so, brothers and sisters, I could not speak to you as spiritual people, but rather as fleshly, as infants in Christ. I fed you with milk, not solid food, for you were not ready for solid food. Even now, you are not ready. Well, that was a good evaluation on his part. They just weren't ready for solid food, so he needed to start them out with some milk. Hebrews 5:12-14, for though by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you, again, the basic elements of the oracles of God. You need milk, not solid food. For everyone who lives on milk, being still an infant, is unskilled in the word of righteousness. But solid food is for the mature, for those whose faculties have been trained by practice to distinguish good from evil. So sometimes you need milk, sometimes you need solid food, and you always need discretion of when to do which. And that's part of being a teacher or a trainer, and it goes into curriculum development well. So here's a little exercise for you. Just take a moment and think through this. You can write it down if you want. You can just think about it in your head if you want. I'll give you a minute to think about this. Think about one of the classes that you're teaching right now, or one of the groups that you're training right now. Who are your students? Who are the students? Describe them. What classes have they taken that have prepared them for the course you are teaching? Do you even know that? Do you even know which been in before? It would be a really good thing to know. If you know their names, then go ahead and write their names down or think through their names. And give one characteristic that makes this student an excellent student. Think about one characteristic with this particular name that makes this person an excellent student. All right, somebody give me a name and one characteristic.
Clive. His name is Clive.
Clive, okay, and a characteristic?
Curious.
You said genius?
Curious.
Curious. I love that. Curious. Okay, that's a great characteristic for a student. And genius isn't bad either. Okay. Anyone else? Yes. Side juice. Philip.
Yeah. Even though he doesn't know English well, he's extremely attentive and asks a lot of questions and very inquisitive.
I love that. Inquisitive, asks good questions, desires learning. Yeah, I had a person was teaching elementary Greek, and this was Guy from Abidjan. Guy did not know English very well at all, but Guy wanted to learn Greek so badly. He would take the English, the Greek word, look at it in English, go to the French word, come back to the English, come back to the Greek, and made the highest score in the class, working with English as in Greek class. It was brilliant for me to watch him and see that desire that he had to learn the language. It was fantastic. Yeah, we need to think of our students in this way. We need to know them by name. We need to know their strengths and also their weaknesses. And we need to know if we are connecting with them or not. I'm teaching intermediate Greek right now, and I have one student in the class, and her name is Prasitha, and I would put her in the genius category. But she is just bright, and so capable. She rarely ever answers a question wrong, but I'd say even more than that. She's a mom with two young kids who's running a ministry, teacher in the church in India, and yet makes it a priority to learn the language because she just wants to learn so badly, which is a great characteristic. So think about your students, and as you're developing a curriculum, you need to consider that. Second, consider the desired outcome for the class. This is that reverse engineering. And it's a bit of what we've done at CHORD. One of the first things we got together with CHORD and talked about with the School of Missions, we asked, well, what do we want the students to become? A person that comes out of this with a certificate or any type of connection to us through a school that we are partnering with, what would we like to see that person be able to do? And so this is where we got the 7 values. It was through this. This is where we got the concept of being, knowing, and doing, is thinking in this way. We wanted to work who a person is in the sight of God, and how that person even looks at themselves in the sight of God. So that's an important step in curriculum development, is thinking about that. Here's another exercise. We won't take much time with this one. You actually did a really good job with this one yesterday as you were going through your presentations. I noticed this, that everybody talked about this. What are the overall outcomes of your curriculum? You've already done that step, and so kudos to you for that. Describe what you hope your students take away from the time in your program. Some of you wrote that right into your vision statement, the vision for the school. Others not only wrote it in the vision statement, but you put it in outcomes. This is what we want to see our students get from this program. And so that's great work that you've done there. And it's really crucial work in developing a curriculum. The third thing in developing a curriculum is a plan for teaching the course. And so you have to come up with how you want the course to go. And you look at it as building blocks, or you look at it as, I like Legos, if you are familiar with Legos and building things with Legos. If you take the smallest little Lego and try to build the foundation with that, and then put bigger things on top of it, it's not gonna go very far. But if you start with the foundational blocks, you can build very, very high. And a curriculum ought to be built that way as well. So plan the teaching for the course. What material are you wanting to give the students? How do you start them out? And if you look at any university program that's good at all, it has 101 level courses, 100 level courses, 300 level courses. In our school catalog for intermediate Greek, it says you must have had elementary Greek to take intermediate Greek. Why? Because you would be totally lost in intermediate Greek without elementary Greek. And do you have that same type of thought in the way that you're developing courses for your school? Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Gabe now. Welcome, Gabe, to the podium.
Do I have enough room? Yannick, do you need to change this? Sorry. So we have to switch slides. All right, thank you. Thanks very much, Steve. My slides are not anywhere near as pretty or aesthetically pleasing as his are. I had some trouble with the template. Same title, but I actually want to talk about some curriculum survey results from a few years ago. Some of you may remember the barrage of emails that I sent out that probably now are a fever dream or have faded from memory when I was trying to get to some of this data. And I commend the brother who preceded me actually in gathering some of the initial data, but I wanted to share the results of this survey in which we kind of found out the required courses for every single school as far as we could get them at the time, which of course this predates CHORD when I first started gathering this information. Some of the schools actually were still in their infancy, were still starting out. So of course some of that information wasn't entirely complete. So this was not the sort of thing that you'd chalk up to being perfectly and scientifically valid, but it is actually very, very, very helpful in terms of seeing patterns across all of the schools together. So I actually keep it rather simple considering that there's only, at this time there were probably about 16 schools. This is still under BMF. There's quite a bit of very interesting findings. I'm going to just simply describe some of the, you could say numbers first, then I'm going to make some observations, and then I'm going to make my 5 recommendations. Okay, some of actually what I'll say about the curriculum will overlap with what Steve already mentioned, but with a little bit more detail. So there were 3 areas. This is before, of course, we had the knowing, being, and doing. They were actually still divided into 3 areas at the time. It started out with biblical knowledge. And across all of the schools, this is actually the one area where we actually have quite a bit of consensus. And of course, these are tried and true. Many of us have been, of course, in the church for decades and did something like MTA or MTP or some other such version of this years ago, as my wife and I did, and many of you did. We know that we had taken a New Testament survey class, an Old Testament survey class, and some kind of principles of exegesis or biblical interpretation. Beyond those 3, some variety starts to kick in among the schools. Only two of the schools of missions actually had some kind of OT or NT interpretation, a little bit more in-depth instruction in how to interpret genres, different genres from each of those 2 sets of books. Half of the schools of missions did actually have another principle of exegesis class, which I imagine maybe get into a little bit, you could say, advanced areas, interpreting a narrative, for example, or interpreting Hebrew poetry or Old Testament poetry or prophecy, some such specific area. That more or less is almost the same as the other. But half, that is only 8 of them, got a little bit deeper in that area, is interesting. Okay? All of the schools of missions, there's another tried and true story, church history. Right? In some cases, I think we even actually use the exact same book or set of books for church history in plain language. Many of us would probably remember that book. Church history, and then half of the schools of missions taught some version of Christ and culture. All of that showed up in the biblical knowledge module or school curriculum, but usually only about half of the schools did it, and I imagine did it in a way that was appropriate to their geography, specific to their school and their culture. But that kind of gives you a fairly good idea of the pattern in that area of biblical knowledge. All right. The next one, spiritual development. Here you can see, of course, around the 16, about 12 of them had some version of spiritual development, spiritual growth, spiritual maturity. 4 of the schools of missions had a spiritual disciplines and character development course. 5, personal spiritual growth, 2, spiritual formation, and 1, spiritual development. All basically different names for more or less the same type of course, even though the content, not necessarily entirely sure how much they overlap, but I'm sure they overlapped quite a bit. This is actually the area in which actually you'd find almost all the courses on marriage. Well, 6 of them had courses on marriage and ministry. 1 of them, church life 1 and 2, and then there's 1 actual school of mission that had 5 different relationship, soft skills, basic counseling, or growth-oriented areas. In fact, that 1 school of mission, which some of you, of course, noticing I'm not mentioning any by name, but you'll see yourself on the screen, that particular actually school of mission had a lot of variety and a lot of individual short intensive courses. the vast majority of those that I've shown for right now, even especially in biblical knowledge, were usually taught in somewhere in the 24-hour, right, 20 to 24-hour classroom hours. These typically are in the 12 to 20-hour range, and then that one school of mission that taught a lot of different ones were 2.5 hours. So we're talking pretty short, intensive modules, perhaps taught over a weekend, on quite a lot. And perhaps that fit their particular way of training, right, the missionaries and ministers in that school. But that was actually a very interesting sort of outlier, right? Most of the schools did sort of collect themselves more or less, almost in some ways imitating what the basic topics. And there's a few that had very interesting and different, right, ways of designing their courses into shorter periods of time, and then with a lot of variety when they did that. Okay. Now, ministry leadership and training. Almost all of the schools of missions, tried and true, of course, had classes on biblical preaching. Sometimes there's an element there of teaching, homiletics, one school, of course, public speaking. Then there were 10 schools of missions that had something involving power of discipleship and even principles of biblical counseling. Within those 10 schools of missions, there were also one of the men and women specific training classes. And actually 3 schools had their principle of discipleship or power of discipleship, and also taught specific training classes for men and women. Outside of that, it was simply just power of discipleship and some kind of principles of biblical counseling, but mostly it was a basic discipleship class. 8 of the schools of missions then also had a making of a disciple class, studying the Bible. When usually the name was somewhere around studying the Bible with someone, making a disciple. Actually, just one had preparing Bible talks, and that was an 8-hour course. And then one school of mission, there it is again, short, intensive modules, effective Bible study, effective outreach, and even counting the cost had its own module of 2.5. All of them basically 2.5-hour, right, classes. So this is interesting. This one in particular had almost more dimensions and more variety than any of the others. Okay, this survey. In fact, you can even see, this is ministry leadership continued. 7 schools of mission, ministry leadership, and the church. So that means 9 of them didn't necessarily address church life and ministry together, but there was almost half. Spiritual leadership showed up in 4 of these schools of missions. 2 of them, emotionally healthy leader, building momentum, another 4. Right, raising, and in fact, a lot of the same schools, 2 schools were the ones that actually taught spiritual leadership and then emotionally healthy leadership or some such kind of class. Basically, 2 of them taught almost all of the variety in that area. 4 actually taught building momentum. Then you can see raising up leaders and discipling, 1, and then all of the rest, you can see examples there of just one school of missions taught public presence. There's one school of mission that is a ministry for you, and actually taught different pathways to different types of ministry. So you can see here a lot of variety, depending on, I suppose, a need, right, and an outcome and a goal within those schools of missions. And then there's that one school of mission that I mentioned before. In this case, there's 9 different ones that all basically revolve around different dimensions of congregational leadership. I mean, finances, ministry as a career, 2 classes actually in that area, shepherding, vision setting, ministry growth, principles of leadership. So a good bit of overlap, but again, short and intensive classes with all the others, but done in a more sort of rapid-fire fashion. All right, and then, wow, the variety of elective courses, pretty significant. In fact, I highlighted a few of these that I thought were interesting because they were not necessarily required. There was actually one school of mission that requires apologetics. It's in their core curriculum. All right. Life and Ministry of Jesus showed up in one of these schools as an actual required class, but usually it was an elective. Holy Spirit, an elective, even though it was taught in 5 different schools of missions. It was unclear whether it was required, and so only in 5 it showed up, and then even the church, some kind of ecclesiology, right, or basic church life, or people of God type of course. All of these that I left out, that were even book specific, like teaching the Psalms, for example, were all part of elective courses. Okay, so here are my observations. All right, and these are 3 areas there's clearly consensus in basic biblical knowledge, right, in courses, which I think we probably wouldn't consider to be all that controversial, right? Now, the depth of interpretive education, that's one thing that we should ask ourselves. Same thing with cultural awareness and responsiveness. Do the schools want to actually, if it's important, to train missionaries or ministers who are aware of what's going on culturally in their context? Know patterns in entertainment, politics, major world historical events there, customs, family life, work life, all of those patterns of how people actually live where they do mission. Okay, that's an important question to ask. The other one, of course, is this depth. How well do we want them to handle the word? However, at a basic or intermediate level, do we want them to handle the word when they leave these programs? That's an important one to answer, and of course, it depends on how these are taught. All right, so that's biblical knowledge, spiritual development, the being. Compared to the two other areas of ministry leadership and biblical knowledge, this one's clearly not as robust as any of the others. Considering that typically here we're only talking about, for most of the schools of mission, there was one course on spiritual disciplines or spiritual formation or biblical maturity, whatever it may be, by different names. Considering that there's actually the neglect of the Holy teaching on the Holy Spirit in general, the fact that no class really appeared on just simply the Holy Spirit, I assume that, of course, in talking about spiritual growth, you're talking about the sanctification process. Address that. However, there's not really, considering actually that in this area, there's also the classes on marriage, but not anything on singlehood, right? Or even doing ministry in singles, and considering this, our School of Missions are supposed to be targeting 20 to 30-year-olds. What exactly is that conveying about spiritual life and relationship? There's not even necessarily some sort of life stage specific course on spiritual life. What spiritual life actually looks like when you're 20 to 30 years old, perhaps as a young married or not. Okay, that's one question we'd ask. That's where this idea of tracks, what proportion of students in our schools of missions are actually single versus married, and do we take account of that when we're actually teaching spiritual growth and maturity? And is there actually a grasp on what it actually means to be a church, to be the body of Christ? And that area, funny enough, you'd think, well, should that be a topic in biblical knowledge or in ministry leadership? This is actually the areas where you can see in developing a curriculum where you notice that the connections between the components of the curriculum are important because they clearly overlap with one another. It's clear that in developing sometimes into these kinds of different components, you could start to silo each of those areas and not connect them to one another. Church life is an important topic. Where it should be taught is a decision that the School of Mission has to make. Ministry leadership, clearly the largest variety of courses, at least especially when it came to the titles of the courses. It was kind of fun. There's like, wow, we come up with all kinds of cool names for these classes. Tried and true, right, considering that we, especially our family of churches, value the power of the preached word and of the taught word, right, to transform the heart of an individual. We very much emphasize that, and that's there well attested across all schools of mission. It's by far the most popular, especially in making disciple making. Right, those two even outpace classes on discipleship. And even considering that there weren't any classes except one school of mission that had a life and ministry of Jesus class. Right, the question then begs the question: what kinds of things are taught about the ongoing ministry of Jesus? Right. And how closely do we teach discipleship to the ministry of Jesus? Right. Nevertheless, when it comes to preaching and teaching and disciple making, right, we have a fairly good amount of classes that center on that. In fact, when I kind of if I could sort of reorganize or reintegrate these areas just in ministry practice, just in ministry leadership, it all pretty much revolved around preaching and speaking, disciple making, and then there was this kind of somewhat shapeless, but hard to name, but some kind of ministry leadership development and church building. But we were somewhat scattered in that area. But they all seem to revolve around these three. Okay, now you can take a look at that for a moment and just ask yourself, are those the three areas? Does that capture most of what we want to convey to a missionary, or minister training at our school? What else should be there or could be there? And I'll kind of I have a couple of questions here. Then these are specific to School of Missions. If you're looking at some of the findings that I present and you think, oh yeah, well, we do teach that, or we have not taught that yet, or we want to develop it, why? Is it a matter of there's no the availability of capable instructors, or there are available instructors, but they haven't been selected to do so? Or is it that we haven't taught it because it just simply doesn't reflect something that we value? Because we value other things. So we'd rather pour in resources and time into that. It could be any combination of those things, right? Because I'm sure that we have many people, right, that know about these topics, but not necessarily are capable of teaching it. That, of course, then leads to the question of, do we actually need to be intentional about training folks who will teach the things that we value? Does that make sense? Yeah. All right, so those are things in different areas. What do we value? Are there people available to do so? Have we actually selected them to do it? Are there things that we value and we actually don't have anybody who we've ever taught or raised up in this area? The extended nature of the ministry practice, the connection between what people are learning when they're doing their ministry internship or their ministry training out in a particular region or sector or area of our church, and what they're taught in the classroom. Are these two things actually in communication with one another? Right, so that if we have said in class that you will get 10 hours of experience planning an event, planning Bible talks, or planning a devotional, that there are people actually in our ministries that are aware of that know this person is actually in the School of Mission and is being trained in this area. This is actually one of the hardest ones. Imagine, considering how busy, right, we can get, having that level of accountability and communication between different components of not just the School of Mission, but then the ministry centers themselves is actually a little harder. It's easier to say, of course, easier said than done, but it's actually a very, very important part of it, because it's that one area where we realize what we're saying is actually what they will experience in some way or another. They will be, and they're not necessarily will master that area, but they will actually be taught it. And then lastly, some of us may know, right, or think that, well, yeah, we don't have classes for some of these topics because they're taught that outside of the School of Mission. They're just taught that simply as a member of that region or through some kind of midweek series. It's good to actually acknowledge that. That's good. If we're saying that we're going to teach them and then they're not learning it anywhere else, while they're just simply living as a disciple in this ministry, that needs to be addressed as well, and that would make a big difference. Okay, so here are my 5 recommendations. Number 1, I think we need to decide what a minister or missionary that we're training should know about hermeneutics. That is, when it comes to handling the Bible and Scripture well and applying it to their actual ministry situation, how well do we want them to know that? How deep do we want them to know that area of biblical knowledge and biblical application? 2, coming from a sociologist, I had to throw this in here. Embrace culturally responsive missional training. I mean, that's a shameless plug, because that's pretty much all I teach. Okay, culturally responsive missional training. Can a disciple who's actually trained in our schools of missions respond thoughtfully to something that is happening in their world? If it's simply a matter of I'm just simply going to preach through it, or preach around it, or preach under it, but not actually claim that a Christian actually has something thoughtful to say about this situation, about this form of music or entertainment, right? Or even some kind of other political situation or some such thing. If we don't give them the vocabulary, they'll find it elsewhere. It just won't be through us. 3, develop at least 2 robust spiritual growth courses, right, or spiritual formation courses, spirit-centered, deep, and dedicated to actually long-term growth in the faith, right? Sustainable life, it could be life stage or spiritual stage sensitive. This actually person knows I am married, or I am single, or I'm a single mother, or I'm a single father, whatever it may be, and there's something that actually will teach me how to be a disciple and serve the church as a minister, as someone in this place in life. Right? So designed as the actual life center and not to be outpaced by module and ministry. Okay? That's why it needs to be robust. And then, of course, address the ecclesiology, the church relational wholeness and holiness, church unity, harmony, conflict resolution. I think there was only 2 schools of ministries that actually had classes on reconciliation and conflict resolution. There probably should be something right within this that address this is who we are as a body, and this is how we maintain our unity and how we deal with conflict. And then lastly, fully address the dimensions of discipleship, where in many of the schools of missions are somewhat scattered, even though we all agree on on the importance of discipleship. We actually need to agree on what dimensions are involved in discipleship. In fact, besides biblical preaching and teaching, my recommendation is that the power of discipleship should be taught as following Jesus, and making and keeping a disciple are 2 sides of the exact same coin. One of the glaring omissions is no class on shepherding. Well, with the exception of one, which is one of those short intensive modules from one of the other schools of missions, right? Absence of shepherding and even integrated into spiritual growth. So the ministry, leadership, and church building, many of those classes could actually, right, be ones that are oriented around the Ephesians 4 model, where all those essential functions are there. A disciple in these schools of missions is actually learning, yeah, I'm making a disciple. Look at all the classes we have on making a disciple, but keeping one, what actually involves keeping one is not, it's not so clear that that's addressed. I'm guessing it is, but it's not so clear that making a disciple and keeping one, right, 2 sides of the same coin, and of course tied to spiritual growth, is all that evident. Men and women in ministry, church growth, development, church financing, raising up and multiplying leaders, all of that could be part of a set of courses within, right, that church leadership that addresses those issues, but not apart from the others. And so here are my suggestions, and I'm anything going to focus on 2 and 3 and 4, because we've already addressed this. Steve did quite well. Do I have aims and outcomes of what a school of mission should simply do? Right, and you'll end up having these slides. Right, as a school of mission, it was already mentioned, you have mission statements. Is this what a school of mission should be doing in our area? Is this what God has directed us, or the Spirit directed us to do here? Then there's actually a way of, number 2, evaluating, when we look at all of our courses, do our courses actually, you could say, as they say here, jibe, you know what I mean, or fit with the school of missions outcomes? Do all these courses actually serve those outcomes? The courses, of course, were developed from a brother who knows about this area, so let's teach that. Without actually thinking of where it connects with everything else. Doesn't mean it shouldn't be taught, but sometimes these were added. In fact, some of the titles of the courses very much kind of fit the personality of the person who taught it, as this is important. But does it actually fit with the overall aims of that school of mission? Could it be adjusted to do so? Okay. The last one, evaluate each course in light of the content and skills that are biblically and practically well attested. Sometimes there are courses that are taught in our schools of missions that don't actually take into consideration some very basic foundational, almost like the canon, as it were, of material in that field. Sometimes they may not even necessarily have communicated with ministers, right, in that area who excel and are very well experienced in that area, and kind of learned from them. In other words, yes, it's geography and culturally sensitive, but those courses should be well-rounded, right? And have, that is, in other words, anyone who takes this class on the planet Earth should learn at least A, B, and C in these areas, okay? And then lastly, this is probably my most important one, is communicating and integrating across the knowing, being, and doing. So for example, of communicating syllabi from one class instructor to another. Even calling and saying, I taught New Testament survey, this is what I taught, I'm going to send it to you, who are teaching a spiritual growth class. And you think, what does that have to do? Why is the NT survey person sending the spiritual growth person their syllabi? Because I should be aware of what you taught. Not only because, of course, it fits with the School of Missions goals, but now I can actually I'm aware of what you taught, and I can even refer to those things that you taught and bring them into this class. So that when they take that NT survey course or that OT survey course, or even Christian culture, then they never come across that material ever again. They just simply have moved on to something else. Here's where communicating across these courses is actually a very helpful thing, and it helps actually the student realize there is actually a great bit of connection between all of these, and it actually helps me apply them in practice. Because now I've heard it once, I've heard it twice, I've heard it 3 times, I've heard it 4 times, I've heard it multiple times, but from different places. As a minister, in my spiritual life, in my biblical knowledge and learning, it actually applies to everything that I do. It's not just simply something that I heard and was done. Amen? And if we can do the flipping the classroom at the end.
Yeah,
If we have time.
I think this would be a great time
You want to
if anyone has any questions.
Questions in?
for this,
Yep.
while you
Yeah.
have your slides up and while we're in
Sure.
the midst of thinking through this.
Sure.
By the way, let me just say this. Bro, excellent job.
Amen. I didn't go too fast.
Gabe, I should have mentioned, Gabe is a PhD, and he has done data research. He knows how to read data. You just don't come up with this kind of summary without having that kind of background. And so he's used his expertise to help us in our schools. And I just want to thank you for doing that.
Amen. All right. Who's Valder?
Just one thing. When you ask a question, can you please stand up? It helps with the Zoom and so on. Thank you.
Yeah, this is a great discussion. If I'm not mistaken, most schools have either 2 years or 3 years of training.
Yeah.
And obviously the question or the issue that Steve raised in the beginning, the amount of teaching matters for every course. Do you have recommendations? I mean, we typically have, right, we have, as I said, 2 years or 3 years. We have a number of semesters in a given year and things like that. But that seems, just from a big picture point of view, to have any encouragement to go the one way or the other. And the tension is there, right? Depending on the students, some are doing ministry, some are not, are they available, and so on and so on and so on. But it would be good to, if you have any thoughts about the overall duration of the training for a student.
Yeah. Yeah, generally the 2 to 3 year cycle, at least for the ways that we are carrying out. One thing to clarify, of course, is the School of Missions are not seminaries. So we have those. So the School of Mission is not supposed to be necessarily copying or somehow imitating a seminary. It is just what it says, a school for missions, right? For training those who are going to be missionaries and ministers. That should be taken into account. Even so, the 2 to 3 year cycle. Now, when I looked, I was kind of peering into the survey here. I mean, we ranged from 102 hours at one school to 1,104 in another.
Yeah.
Most of them are in the upper 200s, 264 classroom hours, a few that are in the 400s. The one school in the thousands almost runs around the clock, I think 46 weeks out of the year, which means that when one course ends, another one begins, and then another set begins, and another set begins, and I'm guessing you can celebrate Christmas. There's like one little day over there. Now, and again, I'm not necessarily trying to target one school or the other. I do wonder how well that works. I think that the way that it works, at least in the design as I saw it, is that there's quite a bit of classroom time, and then there's also the hour doing out and about. And all those are combined into the hours in total. Now, being taught at that clip, if I may say so, wow, 2 years, quite a lot. They're all that learned over that could be tested, processed in that missionary in that context where you're sending people out. It works. In my experience, it seems to be a lot in a short period of time. That's where I think overall 2 to 3 years is adequate, especially in courses that are somewhere in the 24 to 28 hour range for each one. But that's where, of course, and I do recommend balance, especially between the spiritual and the biblical knowledge and the ministry leadership. In fact, if anything, it should emphasize the being more than anything. Yep. Does that help? I don't know. Steve, you want to add something?
to that. I'll stand up here with you and if I have anything to say. I noticed the same thing yesterday in the presentations. In fact, I wrote that down in notes that I was making on the presentations yesterday, that there are some schools that just have a huge amount of hours that you're considering to be training hours or classroom hours. And my question was, how in the world? how are you able to do that? And what are your students? Are they surviving with that? One example is 360 hours of teaching. That's a ton. That's just that's taking it through a master's and a PhD together. And so I think one of the things that we would like to do is to go back and look at that with you, and partnering together. Just look at it with you and just ask, what do you mean by that? When you write down that you're doing 360 hours of teaching, does that mean that for every hour in the classroom, there's 10 on the street living it out? I understand that, if that's what it is. But if you're really having, students in the classroom, the 360 hours of teaching, that is, to me, the recipe for burnout. And so, I think this is the kind of thing that we'll come back and we'll talk about, and because we need some clarification on that. And I think you would probably also appreciate us just asking what exactly does that mean. So, but I think to Valder's point, coming up with let me put it this way, the pattern of how it ought to be done, that's not really what we want to try to do. We want to try to work with you with where you are, with what's best for you in your school, because all the schools are very different. We have some schools where the students do live together, and we have other schools where students fly hours and hours to get to a place. They're probably tired when they get there, and they maximize the number of hours they're there, and then they go back home. We have some synchronous and asynchronous situations going on in our training. I do the same when I'm training teachers around the world. I have some time on Zoom, and I have some time in workshops. And so it needs to be hybrid. It has to be hybrid. It can't be one size fits all, but how can we together figure out what is a good approach for the school where I am doing the teaching and the training?
Yep, that's brother. Yes.
Thanks for this. This is very, very useful. I'm just thinking about the integration and connection between what the students are exposed to and the trainers on the ground sitting in the church walking with students.
Yeah.
Is there sort of a best practice where having the trainers in the classroom when the teaching happens, would that help? Because I think I hear loud and clear that maybe there's a disconnect there, but then also living out what they're being exposed to on the ground, that could be a little separate. So is there a way that one can make sure that integration, instead of just sending here's what we taught, is there a way that we can bridge that gap better?
Yeah. There's I think there's probably a few schools of missions that actually have good best practices here that could share about this. And I'm not sure whether it will come out when we have our academic directors talk. But for example, because we've experienced this in a few schools that I've been a part of, sometimes a course begins and trainers are actually the ones teaching some of those classes, or are co-teaching it, right, with a teacher. That's optimal there. Being aware of both of them, whoever, 2, 3, however many people it is, being aware of what the syllabus, right, is actually going to teach and what their roles they have when they're there. That is, what each the trainer and the teacher is teaching is something that is not, they're not ignorant, mutually ignorant of what it is that they're both covering, because they're like, well, that's not my area, so I'll just train when I'm out there with them. No, they should actually both be aware of that. And actually, this communicated before the semester ever begins. Doing that turns pattern. Trainers and the teachers are actually communicating of what's being, actually, it's kind of simple, honestly. It just simply needs to become pattern of how it's done. One of the challenges that we've encountered is, of course, is some of the students then go off and start doing ministry and have, for example, a mentor or what have you, unaware of what this. That's an indication that yes, to run down the chain, somebody to do that, and I guess to train those people. That's just a chain of communication that needs of time. Once it's there, it actually turns into a pattern. All right. Here's a minute, yes.
Yeah, Professor Kinnard, and sometimes an academic director, a training director, because our syllabi is focused mainly on happens, and sometimes he see the whole training of the class. We began to use for pastoral counseling, disciples, preaching, and where we now give the trainers, okay, this is your role. You have to do that. So my question, do we have to do all that for all the courses? And if we do, won't it increase the training hours we have, because they are either being trained in classrooms or they are being trained in locations? Are we not taking so the locations where they are and still continuing the training rather than also unleashing them in practical ministry? So that's the question that I have. Would that increase our syllabus or will it alter it?
I mean, it could, if I understood the question correctly. You're concerned about adding the classroom hours to yet more outside classroom training, right? That would, I mean, there are I think it's somewhat integrating the two. Yeah, that would be. This is actually a very good. I didn't pay you to say this, of course. It's a very good actually opportunity to talk about flipping the classroom, the importance of flipping the classroom, because that means that the class is not isolated from what's actually happening in their ministry. There's things that they're doing 1 week in class and then doing it in the ministry that same week. And then they're actually bringing what they did in ministry back to the class. Whatever you want to call it, the actual delivery of content isn't actually occurring in the class. That's occurring on their own time. That's where that asynchronous element that Steve was mentioning, they're doing that on their own time to watch the lecture elsewhere. Otherwise, the classroom and the ministry is actually a continuous loop. And in that case, then the you could say the hours, the way that you calculate the hours, those are already completely overlapping between the two. What they're doing outside of class in terms of watching a video lecture and then taking notes and reading would be something completely flexible that they could still complete, but it's still, in other words, these are not they're flowing into each other. Hopefully that helps. Anything? Yes, brother. Sorry, I don't know your name.
Yes, thank you for everything you shared. Very inspiring. I was just wondering, how could we integrate, like if you had thoughts on that, how could we integrate the 7 values of leadership, which is something that is foundational for us, into our syllabus, into our curriculum? Because we could have like modules, hermeneutics, interpretation, church history that can be brainy sometimes, depending on the way you deliver the class. Yeah. Could be a bit heavy on that. But how could we make it kind of more spiritually transformational, applying the 7 values to the classes? So just
I mean, in some ways you kind of started answering your question there by mentioning the syllabi. I have, there are actually 2 separate sets of templates that I'm going to actually send. They'll be part of the folder that Yannick shared for the classes this morning, because I actually have samples. Well, I have one where I have all the things that should be mentioned in a syllabi, that should be included, the structure of a syllabi. Each of those values, the 7 values that we embrace, all of those can find some, now this is meticulous and sometimes painstaking, but it's to actually connect each of those values to material that will be taught. and you just simply need to be specific. That's all. There's no other way around it. You have to specifically link them to each other. In fact, it could be somewhat required. You all agree among one another, both trainers and academic directors, that every syllabus, every class that's taught will cover at least half or more of these spiritual values, or the 7 values that we have. There's other things that I could say, even though we could talk maybe class about transformative, because that's actually very, very, very important. I can't emphasize that enough. The entire educational process should be spiritually formative. It shouldn't just simply be those courses that are designated as so. But I think all of this, in other words, depends on what's included in the syllabus, and making sure that it's actually there for all of them.
Yeah. Did you have a comment about it?
I have a suggestion. Yeah. When we go into the breakout sessions, ask the question or talk about the question, what can CHORD do to help you doing things? Which doesn't mean we are going to do it, but the role of CHORD in something we're working on. For example, we did talk about a common curriculum, and we're not doing that. That just doesn't work, right? But if you think about curriculum development and the question, what could CHORD do to help? That would be a meaningful result from this conference, and we could then work with it and figure out how to use it.
Yeah, we want to be a help. We want to be a help to you in your schools. And one of the reasons we're not doing a common curriculum is because every time that comes up, my body shuts down, and they wake me up a week later or something like that. It's just that would be an incredibly difficult job and very difficult to do given the nature of our schools and how different the schools are. And so we have come up with some things that we feel like are really good to tie the schools together, like the 7 values, like the principles of being, knowing, and doing, and that kind of thing. But we also recognize there has to be flexibility. I just want to comment a little bit on your question about how do we incorporate these 7 values into the curriculum. I think what Gabe said is exactly true. You can actually write, and part of a template for a good curriculum is this class, and you can just write every time that the 7 values ought to be, and then you go back and you look at the particular classes you're teaching within the larger class, and you in different ones you highlight 1 or 2, and it can only, you only have to highlight it for 5 minutes. It's not a big thing, but you're highlighting these as you go because you do this in front of the students. A second thing I would mention, I actually had this in a slide coming up later on, but I'll just talk about it now, is known as the hidden curriculum. Okay, everybody hear that? The hidden curriculum. And the hidden curriculum can be good or bad, okay? And you have to just realize that there's both sides to it, okay? A hidden curriculum can mean that you are naturally bringing your bias to the curriculum, and it's hid all in your curriculum. And that happens all the time. It happens in schools all the times. And even as we were going through this, you probably noticed some of the things that we highlight in our churches because they are just, I'll put it this way, they're part of our DNA. And it hasn't necessarily come from us. It came from Campbell. It came from Stone. It came from the traditional Church of Christ, but that's it. The fact that there are less courses on Jesus than courses that may point from the book of Acts. Okay, that is from the Church of Christ. That is from Campbell, actually. Campbell did that. He didn't care very much about the Gospels, but he cared a lot about the book of Acts and the ministry of Paul. And so that's a hidden curriculum that's there, and you might not even recognize the bias is there because you might not have thought through it that far. That's negative side of a hidden curriculum. There is a positive side to a hidden curriculum. If you know the bias you might have, and we have a bias of these 7 values. That's a bias that we have. I think it's a healthy bias. I think it's a good bias. I think it's a bias that we've worked on for quite a while, of being, knowing, and doing. Again, I think that's a healthy bias. And so as you're constructing the curriculum, that ought to appear. But here's the thing, it ought to appear not only on the curriculum, it ought to appear in the classroom in a hidden way that becomes more revealed over time. And one way, let me put it this way, one way that students are going to get the 7 values is that they see them lived out in your life. Yes. And it's not just going to come from teaching. It's not just going to come from pages in a curriculum. It's going to come from your life. And honestly, that is the best way to teach the 7 values, or to teach being, knowing, and doing. Show that you value your relationship with God. Show that you know who you are in front of God. Show that you understand that you are made in the image of God, and that is just a part of who you are, and every day you live that out. That's the best way to teach being to the students, by them seeing it lived out in your lives. That's the hidden that will not get written down no matter what template he gives you. But it's written in our hearts. Okay? And so this hidden curriculum is something that needs to be understood from both sides. You have to be careful what you bring into the curriculum, and on the other side of things, you ought to be bringing into the classroom who you are as a person in your.
Tanner? Yep, Tanner.
I was going to ask a question about, I feel sometimes the temptation in the classroom setting is for it to be the talking and listening, reflection. Yeah. And so what value, or maybe it's later today, but you place in assignments that teachers give, or instructional things, laboratory settings in a classroom, anything other than just a traditional lecture note-taking, or part of these curriculums?
Yeah, I could probably give another nod to the importance of the flipped classroom in that case. All right, let me just take advantage. I mean, one of the things I think that you're talking about with the flipped classroom takes everything that would typically be taught in class, as you said. We come to class to hear a lecture and have concepts, ideas, images conveyed to us. In the flipped class, and then you go home and you do worksheets, application, read some more, try to apply it, flip that. So now the lecture and the basic ideas and concepts are actually being delivered outside of class. And when they come to class, it's actually now having already done some of this reading. You actually come here to apply it rather than the other way around. If you come here to actually apply the work, then you could actually do it with others. It's collaborative, and you get feedback from the instructor right then and there. When you're at home doing homework, right, and doing some of that work, unless you have your instructor on speed dial or something, you know what I mean? What do you mean by this? Which is not going to happen typically. You are left to your own, and then you have to come back and try to figure out some other way of getting clarity. In the flipped classroom, you can actually do all of this collaborative and intensive work among groups, which I just finished teaching a course where 65% of it was flipped. So I'm not talking about every single course is completely flipped. The teacher or teachers decide these are portions of the course they can be flipped. And then you could be very creative. In that class that I taught before, I created scenarios. And groups of 5 or 6 came up with ways of how would we respond in this scenario. Why we responded this way, and this justification, and they would present that to the class. And there I could just simply incorporate what everyone taught on the go. In fact, in that class, I used slides once. in 14 weeks. Otherwise, I just simply wrote out what they were conveying to me. I usually tell them I learn more than all of you do. Thank you. But that's actually one that all kinds of creativity that could be worked into a flipped kind of arrangement like this. Hopefully that helps. It's the tip of the iceberg. But that's where these kinds of questions that I asked here, what practice do we need the students to actually do outside of class in their ministry before they come into class and talk about it here, where they could get some collaboration and even depth. So see, it's not separated. In some cases, actually, they're initiating the work out there in ministry and then bringing it to the class. And then that's where you could do it.
Do you have more information on where you, or?
Yeah, I had an idea, yeah, using the Book of Acts, actually.
Okay, we'll go to that in a minute here.
Yep.
There's an online question. Let me just read it. Thank you, Gabe and Steve. Very helpful. A question for other academic directors and teachers. Do you have AI policies in place to ensure students work their own? Related question, do you rely on written assignments for assessment purposes?
Okay, I personally do with Mountain Theological. I just wrote it myself. I'll be happy to share that with you. I think it is fair. There are basically two types of AI. There's assisted AI, in which you use every single day, whether you want to or not. It just makes life easier for you. Pull up a map. You haven't literally gone and opened up a map. Something did that for you, okay? But then there is generative AI, in which they are generating material for you, summaries of books that you haven't read yet, papers that you have not written. That's the kind of thing that you need to be super careful and actually should not be used in the classroom or by the students. They need to do their own work. The assisted AI can send you to the book. So we Google books all the time. I didn't know the author to Transformational Teaching, so Carlos Googled it and found the authors, and cheated by doing. No, that's just we do that, right? That's what Google does. However, hopefully he didn't then go to ChatGPT and say, "Tell me everything I need to know from this book," And I know he didn't. That's the generative. And so I have something that I can send if any of you are interested in that.
Yeah, I kind of keep it somewhat. I tell the students at the beginning of the class, do your own work. At least be able to walk out of here saying, "I wrote that." I may not have liked it, or it may not have been grammatically correct, or what have you, but I did it, rather than someone else did it. Appeal to their integrity. I also then assign low-stakes writing assignments in class in response to a certain scenario, and then I compare it to what they turn in on Canvas online. And then I do send a warning message. Ways of recognizing, I know that you used AI. This seems to have all the markings of AI writing. You can use it for exactly what he said. You could use it for this, for organizing material, for brainstorming, for getting ideas, generating ideas, but you cannot have it write anything for you. And so I may dock a point and then tell him, you've been warned.
I even would say not for generating ideas personally, because you don't use your own gray matter when that happens, and you don't develop your skills to be able to do it. And studies show you don't even remember what was just generated. It's the algorithm generating it, and you won't remember it a day later. If you're doing the work of thinking through it yourself, chances are you're going to remember it. Okay, I think a couple of quick ones, and then.
Question, I was struck by the life stage thing, marriage, singleness, things like that. I think those are very interesting ideas, but I think our experience has been with the less than 300 hours, there's just too much. And I think one of the questions that comes to mind is the goal of a program like this is, for many of us, is training younger people to go be on a mission team, lead something, but we end up with people in situations where they're helping out in a more mature church, and they have all this adult drama of marriage conflicts and older singles who are really struggling staying faithful. So I have all these life issues that we just haven't had time to deal with. So I don't know what I'm asking exactly, but I feel like there isn't people into those kind of things, and I think we end up getting young people kind of sucked into some really challenging in life, and I'm not sure. I mean, this may be kind of how we do ministry question as much as is a question for, but maybe it's partly a question for CHORD. But my feeling is we've somewhat intentionally avoided some of those topics because we feel like we can't cover everything, and throwing a 25-year-old into a situation with a 40-year-old couple that are about is probably not wise.
Yeah.
So I don't know what you think about those things. Should we be doing something different? Should we be having an advanced SOM? I don't know.
I actually feel like that falls more under mentoring and discipling, or coaching, if you like that term, of having people connected with a more experienced person in the ministry, and they talk once a week, every other week, and they go over those kind of things. But I know when we first moved to New York, and it was a long time ago now, over 40 years ago, that we moved from the South, Lee and I did, and there were so many different scenarios that were happening in people's lives in New York that I didn't even know those scenarios were possible. Into so many married some because of wanting to immigrate into the, and I was like, what do I do now? And so we just got together as a ministry to talk through it, but they're all different, every one of them. So you can't even come up in some of the rule of thumb. It's what needs to happen in every, they're also different. So ministry mentoring situation. Here, then I saw, I think, Mike.
Yeah, I just wanted to say this session that when of school undergone any kind of teaching or preparation to put together, I think I just called our Nigerian and asked them for what they were using, and then we just changed the name, from Neo Song.
So ultimately you could thank Douglas Jacoby for
who put all that together for them. But this is to go deeper into thinking about what I'm teaching in relation to the students and where they are beyond just what I know has been used time. Because even before that, we had the MTA courses. We had 12 courses that we did in Nairobi, and we had gone through that, and we were doing a second round of it. But it was never really thinking about what was needed on the ground. So for me, this is very helpful to change that. And so I appreciate the lessons that have been shared and that we are learning now. On now developing the curriculum, possibly now as a school, as we think through that. I don't know how we need to be able to go about it, maybe discussions with that, because of the material we already have that we have used over time. Would you suggest that we rethink some of that, or is it just about figuring out which particular ones are best and needed for us according to our needs?
Okay, let me just say for all of us here, pause, take a breath. That holy space in your breath, if you're at the Teleos conference, breathe in for a second, that's the holy space, and exhale. You don't need to go back and flip every classroom, okay? You don't need to do that. That would be mayhem. It would be too much work for you, and your students would hope that you never went to another CHORD Forum after that, okay? You don't need to go back and immediately throw the curriculum out and start all over again. Some of you are in the middle of you're 2.5 years in. You got 1 semester left. Finish it, and as you're finishing, want to do next, okay? And so these are good, these are ideas, hopefully good ideas, hopefully food for thought. And so I just want to encourage all of us, let's just pause and take in some of these things. A time will come for us to talk more about these things, okay? So Joe, and then Mike, and then Betsy, and we need to move on.
Yeah, super helpful, especially kind of we're in this reboot after 4 years. But I wonder if you could, and maybe there's not an answer to this, but you're actually leaning into it, speak to the tension of we're not a seminary, we're not Pepperdine, we're not Mountain. We wanted our students, a lot of them, their life situation, I see some of these expectations, I'm like, I don't know how they can do that. Given some of these kids are parents, so I don't know if there's an answer to this. Do is see if they're ministry and equip them, and then if they are, encourage them to go get their. That was kind of a goal. There's that tension. We don't want to discourage them on, and some of our actually now MDiv or whatever. The tension we feel with our students is of life and this, and even because of how we've built others, there is this. You should have a degree, and if in that coming out. So I don't know if there's really an answer to it. Trying to wrestle with too much, how much.
Yeah, well, I guess I could put this simply. The question that you're asking is, should we lay the emphasis, right? Especially if someone goes to the program, it's not a seminary, it's not a 4-year degree or anything, but you would want them to come out, I mean, I put it simply, come out a joyful disciple of Jesus, right? And I'm not talking about joyful like hype. Well, they okay, know how to handle the word responsibly. I don't just simply pick proof texts because they happen to fit what I want to teach that week. I'm actually responsible with it, and I can answer to it. All of this is centered on my life in the Spirit, growing sustainably for the long haul. I know how to refresh myself. I know what it means to at least heal, to know where I'm at. I'm aware of that, and I could actually point that out in others. I'm not here to fix them, you know what I mean, or to solve their problems. I'm actually someone who's spiritually aware and awake, and I know where I'm at. And then I'm learning how to build the church through ministry, through studying the Bible with people, through evangelism, right? And actually know how to collaborate and use the gifts that I have. Honestly, they can come out and have that in balance, even though I said it in a fairly crude way, you know what I mean? That's great. So, but the idea is that these areas actually have some emphasis, even though they're not the equivalent of a 4-year degree or whatever.
The word flourishing, that they are flourishing as a disciple of Jesus. And I think that's a good goal for us to have in our schools. And the fact is, Joe, some people are going to come out and they're going to pick specialties and certain things they want to concentrate in. And so that shouldn't be the job of our school to do that. It should be to help them flourish as a disciple, learn some great ministry skills, and then they can, especially in the United States, they can pick and choose some really good programs. And now there are internationally some programs that they can become more advanced in certain specialties. So, what do you say, Mike? And
great job, Gabe. Thank you, Steve. Really great. Think about struck the idea. Gabe kept mentioning classes that I think that are 20 hours. Our classes are 14 hours. So we actually do New Testament into. But I'm really struck with the shepherding class. I'm so convicted that we don't have a shepherding class. That idea. I'm really struck by the need to coordinate the classroom with the trainer, the disciple. And in Boston and Nesson, we particularly rely on the trainers to do a lot. Our I'll offer this as a bit of a suggestion and confession at the same time. We used to do this, and 3 or 4-ish years ago we let go of it. But we used to require all the students to get with their recycling partner and create a recycling plan for the semester, rooted in the classes, and organized around knowing, being, and doing. And then at the end of the semester, the discipler had to submit a report that got done or did not get done. And I wish we would continue to do that because I'd be far less convicted right now than I am. But it may be a bit of a starting point for trying to coordinate the classroom.
Is that from Gordon Cromwell? Yeah. A good thing. You can learn good things from seminaries at times. That thought was from Gordon Cromwell.
Well, it was kind of along those same lines. Was at the end of the 2 or 3 years, is there sort of an evaluation tool to see the effectiveness, or even for a time for a student to reflect, this is my moving forward, what I've gained, what I'm taking with me, or some kind of thing. If there already is, or if there could be benefit to that.
It's a good idea. I don't really have.
In fact, in the notes that we have for curriculum suggestions, there's only 4 components. The 4th one is how the school assesses itself. And that's through student testimonials and debriefs, which could usually be done simply by online surveys, but then also selecting a few of them to interview them about how it went for them. So you get some good kind of little qualitative response from them.
Reflection is good.
She said exactly right.
Good for the school, good for the student. Is it quick?
I just want to make a comment along those lines. In Lagos, I know at some point we have a board, which Emmanuel mentioned yesterday. And so at some point, I was the vice chair of the board, and I was asked to help evaluate the school. So we conducted a survey where the students, both current students and alumni, we reached out to all of them and got their feedback. And also did the same thing with the teachers, the trainers, and then found a way to communicate everything we learned all around. And even got a brother, like a consultant, we paid him to kind of like do what you just did with the survey and come up with recommendations of things we could work on. I just want to mention that. It was helpful.
Good. You have anything else?
No, I could do that for other things.
Yeah. Give it up for Gabe, everybody.
Even a Yankee fan.
I just have one last thing that I would like to say to this room right here, because this is the last time I will be speaking to this room. I want to thank you for the work that you're doing around the world. It is so inspiring. I was sitting there yesterday taking notes, and I'm very inspired by the work that you're doing across the globe and on Zoom as well. We have so many time zones that are represented here, so many countries that are represented here. We want to continue to grow. We want to continue to partner with other people. That takes time, it takes effort, but if you hear of other schools that maybe they are interested in learning what we do at CHORD, let them know about it and introduce us to them, and we can have a conversation together. Personally, I love schools of mission. This is so much a part of my heart and who I am as a person. I am very grateful for the partnership that we have with all of you, and I'm grateful to collaborate together. I grew up in a school of mission atmosphere. I've been working with schools of missions for 30 plus years. I've actually been in the ministry 50 plus years. Started as a kid in college at 17, worked for the New York Church for over 40 years. And now it is such a dream to be able to work with CHORD, and I am so grateful for the partnership that we all have together. I'm really grateful for this forum. Most of my work has happened in Africa and in the Caribbean and in New York and with the American Commonwealth, bits and pieces at other places, but I'm really grateful for those of you that I haven't worked with before to have the opportunity for us to collaborate together. I want to say I love what our schools are doing together. I love this initiative that we have with CHORD. I'm so grateful for Yannick and for Lucy and the work that they're doing, even behind the scenes here. There would be no forum without them. I'm really thankful for Angie and Josie as well, that have put so much work into this. She sits over there quietly, but we all know, all of us in CHORD know, this is how things really get done. It's through Angie. And Valder, I love you. Thank you for your partnership. David, you're my soul brother, and I love you. And thank you for including me in this. And I'm always grateful for the time that we spend together. And Chris Aurelio, great to partner with you specifically. Joel, working together with other things. I probably left somebody out. But I did want to just take a moment personally and say, schools of missions, I started 2 nights ago talking about hope. There is great hope for us in our churches because of the schools of missions. There are young people that are trained. We have the opportunity, I really believe that we have the opportunity to help fashion a new way of doing things in our churches by people getting trained well, and us working together to see these schools of missions flourish. So thank you.